Jake pulled his truck into the gravel driveway and turned off the engine. The silence hit him first. After years of city traffic and honking horns, the quiet felt almost strange. He stepped out and looked at the old cabin his grandfather had left him. Paint was peeling from the wooden walls and weeds had taken over what used to be a neat flower garden. But it was his now. His grandfather had passed away 6 months ago and the lawyers had finally finished all the paperwork. 15 acres of land, a 2-bedroom cabin and a private road that led from the main highway straight to his front door. The will had been clear. Everything belonged to Jake now. He grabbed his toolbox from the truck bed and walked toward the cabin. The key still worked, just like his grandfather had always promised it would. Inside, dust covered everything, but the furniture was solid. His grandfather had built most of it himself. Jake ran his hand along the kitchen table where he'd eaten countless breakfast meals during summer visits as a kid. The next morning, Jake was outside fixing a loose board on the front porch when he heard footsteps on gravel. A woman was walking up his driveway. She looked to be in her 50s, wearing expensive workout clothes and carrying a folder. Her blonde hair was pulled back tight, and she had the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning," she called out in a voice that sounded friendly but felt cold. "You must be the new owner. I'm Barbara Henderson, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association." Jake set down his hammer and walked over to meet her. "Jake Miller. Nice to meet you." Barbara's smile got bigger but somehow less warm. "Your grandfather was such a sweet man. He was very accommodating to our community needs over the years." "Community needs?" Jake asked. Barbara opened her folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. "Well, our residents have been using your access road for their morning walks and jogging routes for over 10 years now. It's become quite an important part of our community lifestyle." Jake looked down the road that led from the highway to his cabin. It was the only way to reach his property. "This is a private road," he said slowly. "Oh, I understand that technically, yes." Barbara waved her hand like she was brushing away something unimportant. "But your grandfather had an informal agreement with our community. He never minded when our residents used it for recreational purposes." "What kind of agreement?" Barbara shuffled through her papers. "Nothing written down, of course. Your grandfather was very trusting, but our community has established usage patterns here. Some of our residents use this road to walk their dogs. Others jog along it in the mornings. A few families even use it as a shortcut when the main road gets busy." Jake felt a knot forming in his stomach. "How many people are we talking about?" "Oh, not too many. Maybe 15 or 20 residents who use it regularly, sometimes more on weekends when families want to explore the area." Barbara's tone made it sound like she was doing him a favor by keeping the number so low. "Look, Barbara, I appreciate you coming over to introduce yourself, but this is my property now and I'm planning to put up a gate." The change in Barbara's face was instant. Her fake smile disappeared completely. "A gate?" "Yes, a gate. This is private property and I want to control who has access to it." Barbara's voice got sharper. "Mr. Miller, I don't think you understand the situation here. Our community has been using this road for years. You can't just cut off access that people have been relying on." "Actually, I can. It's my land." Barbara stepped closer and Jake could see the anger building in her eyes. "There are legal concepts you might not be aware of. Prescriptive easements, for example. When a community has been using private property openly and continuously for a certain period of time, they can establish legal rights to continue that use." Jake had never heard of prescriptive easements, but something about the way Barbara said it made him suspicious. "Are you a lawyer?" "I don't need to be a lawyer to understand property rights. I've been dealing with these issues for years as HOA president." Barbara's voice was getting louder. "Your grandfather understood that being a good neighbor means working with the community, not against it. My grandfather is gone now, and I'm not interested in having strangers walking through my property whenever they feel like it." Barbara's face turned red. "These aren't strangers. These are established community members who have been using this access route as part of their daily routines. Some of our elderly residents depend on this road for their exercise walks because it's safer than the busy main street. There are public parks for that. The nearest public park is 3 miles away." Barbara was almost shouting now. "This road has become an essential part of our community infrastructure." Jake felt his own temper rising, but he kept his voice calm. "Barbara, I understand change can be difficult, but this is my property, and I have the right to decide who uses it." Barbara stuffed her papers back into the folder. Mr. Miller, I strongly advise you to reconsider your position. Our community has invested a lot of time and energy into maintaining access to this road. We've even done minor maintenance on it over the years. What kind of maintenance? Well, some of our residents have filled potholes with gravel. And last winter, several community members helped keep it clear of snow. Jake almost laughed. You're telling me that because some people put gravel in a few holes, they now have rights to my road? I'm telling you that our community has established patterns of use that create certain legal expectations. Barbara's voice was cold now. Expectations that can't simply be ignored because ownership has changed hands. I think this conversation is over. Barbara took a step back but didn't turn to leave. Mr. Miller, I hope you'll think carefully about what I've said. Our community values cooperation and mutual respect. We don't want any unnecessary conflicts, neither do I. That's why I'm being direct with you now instead of just putting up the gate without warning. A gate would be a very hostile gesture toward the community. A gate would be me protecting my property. Right? Barbara stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away. But instead of heading back toward the road, she took out her phone and started making a call while walking slowly down his driveway. Jake watched her go, feeling uneasy. Something about Barbara's attitude bothered him beyond just the disagreement about the road. She'd acted like she had some kind of authority over his property, like his ownership was somehow less important than her community's convenience. That evening, Jake called his cousin Danny, who worked in real estate. Prescriptive easements are real, Danny explained over the phone, but they're not as simple as this HOA lady made them sound. The use has to be open, notorious, continuous, and hostile to the owner's rights. Plus, the time requirements vary by state. In most places, it's at least 10 to 20 years. So could they actually have a legal claim? Maybe, but probably not. The key word is hostile. If your grandfather gave permission for people to use the road even informally, then their use wasn't hostile to his rights. That usually defeats an easement claim. Jake felt some relief, but Danny wasn't finished. The bigger concern is what this Barbara person might do next. HOA presidents with too much time on their hands can make life really difficult for property owners. Document everything, and don't let anyone pressure you into agreements you don't want to make. Jake hung up the phone and looked out his window at the road that led to his cabin. Tomorrow, he was going to call a fence company about installing a gate. Jake woke up Tuesday morning to find an envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a typed letter on official-looking letterhead that read, Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Legal notice. Dear Mr. Miller, the letter began. This notice serves to inform you that the Willowbrook Estates HOA has established prescriptive easement rights to the access road on your property through continuous, open, and notorious use for more than 15 years. Any attempt to block or restrict community access to this established route may result in legal action for interference with property rights. The letter was signed by Barbara Henderson in flowing script, with HOA president and community legal representative printed underneath her name. Jake read the letter twice, then called his cousin Danny again. She's bluffing, Danny said after Jake read him the letter. First off, HOAs don't just declare easements exist. That's something courts decide. Second, she's calling herself a community legal representative, which sounds official but means nothing. Unless she's actually a lawyer representing the HOA, this is just intimidation. So I should ignore it? Document it, but don't let it scare you. People who actually have legal rights don't usually lead with threatening letters. They lead with evidence and proper legal procedures. That afternoon, Jake was replacing a broken step on his front porch when he noticed people walking on his road. A man and woman in matching jogging outfits were coming up the driveway, talking loudly about their workout routine. They waved at Jake like they were greeting a neighbor, then continued past his cabin toward the back of his property. 10 minutes later, they jogged back past him, still chatting. The woman called out, "Beautiful property. Your grandfather always said hello when we passed by." Before Jake could respond, they were gone. He stood there holding his hammer, wondering if he should have said something. But what? They seemed friendly enough and they weren't bothering anything. Still, it felt strange having people treat his driveway like a public trail. The next morning, Jake was drinking coffee on his porch when he saw an older man walking a small dog up his road. The dog stopped to do its business right in front of Jake's mailbox. The man looked around, then just kept walking without cleaning it up. "Hey," Jake called out. "You need to clean that up." The man turned around looking surprised. "Oh, sorry. I don't usually carry bags this early in the morning." "Then maybe don't walk your dog on private property." The man's face changed. Private property? This road has always been open to community use. Barbara Henderson told everyone it was fine to continue using it. Barbara Henderson doesn't own this property. I do. Well, she's the HOA president. She handles these kinds of arrangements. The man's voice was getting defensive. "Look, I've been walking Buttons here every morning for 3 years. Never had a problem before. The problem is that you're trespassing." "Trespassing?" The man laughed. "That's a bit dramatic, don't you think?" "It's just a morning walk." Jake set down his coffee cup and walked toward the man. "Would you walk through my living room just because the previous owner let people do it?" "That's completely different." "No, it's really not. This is my property and I'm asking you to stay off it." The man stared at Jake for a moment, then turned and walked away, muttering something about unfriendly neighbors and community spirit. By Thursday, Jake had counted 12 different people using his road for various purposes. Joggers, dog walkers, and what looked like families taking evening strolls. Some waved and smiled, others acted like he wasn't there. All of them seemed to think they had every right to be on his property. That evening, Jake decided to take a walk around the Willowbrook Estates neighborhood to get a better sense of the community. The houses were all large and expensive looking, with perfect lawns and 3-car garages. He noticed several residents out walking, but they were all using the neighborhood's internal sidewalks and streets, not cutting through anyone's private property. He was heading back to his truck when he heard familiar voices. Barbara Henderson was standing in the driveway of a large colonial house, talking to a small group of neighbors. "The situation is becoming quite concerning," Barbara was saying. "This new property owner seems determined to cut off access that our community has enjoyed for years." Jake moved closer, staying in the shadows beside a large oak tree. "Can he really do that?" asked a woman with gray hair. "Legally, it's complicated," Barbara replied. "But the real issue is community relations. We've been good neighbors to that property for years. When his grandfather needed help with snow removal or had medical emergencies, our residents were there to help. Now his grandson wants to shut us out completely." "That doesn't seem right," said a man holding a leash with a golden retriever. "It's not right," Barbara agreed. "And it's not legal either. We have established usage rights that can't just be ignored. I've been researching the law on this, and I'm confident we can fight any attempts to block our access." Jake felt his jaw clench. Barbara was telling her neighbors that she was researching the law, but her legal notice had been full of intimidating language with no actual legal basis. "What can we do?" asked the gray-haired woman. "Well, first we need to continue using the road as we always have. If we stop now, it might hurt our legal position later. Second, we need to document our usage patterns. I want everyone to keep track of when you use the road and for what purposes." "Should we be confrontational if he tries to stop us?" asked the man with the dog. "Absolutely not," Barbara said quickly. "We're going to handle this professionally and legally, but we also can't let intimidation tactics force us to give up rights we've had for years." Jake had heard enough. He walked back to his truck, his mind racing. Barbara was actively encouraging people to continue trespassing on his property while telling them it was legal and justified. She was also portraying him as the aggressor, even though he'd been completely reasonable in his interactions with everyone. Friday morning brought a new development. Jake was in his yard when he noticed a woman taking photos of his property with a professional-looking camera. She was standing in his driveway taking pictures of his cabin, his truck, and even his mailbox. "Excuse me," Jake called out. "What are you doing?" The woman looked up, not seeming embarrassed at all. "Oh, hi. I'm Jennifer Walsh. I live over in Willowbrook. Barbara asked me to document the current condition of the access road and surrounding area for our community records." "Community records?" "Yes, we're building a file to show our historical usage of this area." Barbara said it was important to have photographic evidence of how the community has been using this space. Jake walked closer to the woman. "Did Barbara mention that you'd be taking these photos on private property without permission?" Jennifer's confident expression faltered slightly. "Well, I'm just photographing the road area that the community uses. The road that's on my property." "Right, but it's been community access for years." "Says who?" "Barbara Henderson. She's very knowledgeable about property law and community rights." Jake almost laughed. Jennifer, I'm going to ask you to leave my property and delete those photos. Delete them? But these are for community protection purposes. They're unauthorized photos taken on private property. That could be considered harassment or invasion of privacy. Jennifer's face went pale. I had no idea. Barbara made it sound like this was all perfectly legal. Maybe you should be more careful about taking legal advice from someone who isn't a lawyer. Jennifer quickly put her camera away and hurried toward the road. I'm sorry. I really didn't know. After she left, Jake sat on his porch steps and thought about everything that had happened in just 1 week. Barbara wasn't just encouraging trespassing. She was organizing a systematic campaign to document usage of his property while telling people they had legal rights they probably didn't have. That afternoon, Jake called a local attorney who specialized in property law. Document everything, the lawyer advised. Keep records of every interaction, every letter, every incident. If this escalates, you'll want a clear timeline of what happened and when. Should I be worried about their easement claims? Based on what you've told me, probably not. But the bigger concern is harassment. If this HOA president is organizing people to trespass and take photos on your property, that could cross the line into illegal behavior. Jake spent the weekend setting up security cameras around his property and ordering materials to build a gate. Monday morning, he was going to end this situation once and for all. Jake was up before dawn on Saturday morning, loading fence posts and gate hardware into his truck. He'd spent the previous evening measuring and planning, and today he was finally going to install the gate that would end this whole mess with Barbara and the HOA. The gate he'd chosen was simple but effective, a 6-foot-wide metal frame that would swing across the road about 50 feet from the main highway, not too close to his cabin to maintain privacy, but close enough to the road that anyone approaching would clearly see they were entering private property. By 8 in the morning, Jake had the first post planted and was working on leveling it when he heard a car door slam. He looked up to see Barbara Henderson marching toward him, her face red with anger. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded. Jake didn't stop working, installing a gate on my property. "This is completely unacceptable. You cannot block community access to this road. Watch me." Jake continued adjusting the post level. Barbara moved closer and Jake could see her hands shaking with rage. "Mr. Miller, I am ordering you to stop this installation immediately." Jake straightened up and looked at her. "You're ordering me? As president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA, I have the authority to protect community property rights. This isn't community property. This is my property. That road serves essential community functions. Our residents depend on it for recreation, exercise, and emergency access." "Emergency access?" Jake almost laughed. "What kind of emergencies? What if someone had a medical emergency while walking back here? What if there was a fire and emergency vehicles needed quick access to the area? Then they'd use the main highway just like emergency vehicles access every other private property in the county." Barbara's voice got higher and more frantic. "You're being completely unreasonable. This gate will cut off access that dozens of community members have relied on for years." Jake went back to work on the gatepost. "That's the point." "I will not allow this to happen." Jake stopped and turned to face Barbara directly. "What exactly are you planning to do to stop me?" "I'll call the authorities. I'll report you for illegal obstruction of community access rights." "Go ahead. I'd be happy to explain to the police that I'm installing a gate on my own property." Barbara pulled out her phone and started dialing. "We'll see about that." Jake continued working while Barbara paced back and forth, talking loudly into her phone. He could hear fragments of her conversation, something about illegal blockades and community property theft and immediate police response needed. 20 minutes later, Jake heard sirens approaching. 2 police cars pulled up to the edge of his property, and 3 officers got out. Barbara immediately rushed toward them, waving her arms and talking rapidly. Jake set down his tools and walked over to meet the officers. The senior officer, whose name tag read Sergeant Torres, looked tired and slightly annoyed. "Mr. Miller?" Sergeant Torres asked. "That's me. We received a 911 call about someone illegally blocking access to community property. Can you explain what's happening here?" Before Jake could answer, Barbara jumped in. "Officer, this man is installing an illegal gate to block access to a road that our community has used for over 15 years. We have established prescriptive easement rights that he's trying to violate." Sergeant Torres held up his hand to quiet Barbara, then looked at Jake. "Sir, is this your property?" "Yes." Jake pulled out his property deed and handed it to the officer. "I inherited it from my grandfather 6 months ago." Sergeant Torres studied the deed, then looked at the partially installed gate. "And you're installing this gate on your own property?" "Correct. About 50 feet inside my property line." The second officer, Officer Kim, was looking at Barbara's paperwork. "Ma'am, do you have any legal documents showing this easement you mentioned?" Barbara shuffled through her folder frantically. "Well, it's not formally documented, but our community has established usage patterns that create legal rights under prescriptive easement law." "So you don't have any legal documentation?" Officer Kim asked. "The documentation is our 15 years of continuous use. That's how prescriptive easements work." Sergeant Torres looked back at Jake's deed, then at Barbara. "Ma'am, prescriptive easements are civil legal matters that get decided in court, not by police officers. This gentleman has every right to install a gate on his own property." Barbara's face turned even redder. "But what about our community access? What about the rights we've established?" "Those are questions for lawyers and judges, not police officers," Sergeant Torres said firmly. "Calling 911 for a civil property dispute is inappropriate and takes resources away from actual emergencies." "This is an emergency," Barbara insisted. "He's stealing community property." Officer Kim stepped forward. "Ma'am, no property is being stolen here. This man is exercising normal property rights on his own land." The third officer, a younger man named Officer Bryant, had been walking around the gate installation area. "Everything looks proper here," he told Sergeant Torres. "Gates being installed well inside the property line, professional-grade hardware, no safety hazards." Barbara was getting more frantic. "You don't understand. Our entire community depends on this access. We have elderly residents who need this route for their daily exercise. We have families who use this as a safe walking area away from traffic." "Ma'am," Sergeant Torres said patiently, "those are all nice benefits, but they don't create legal rights to use someone else's private property." "But we've been using it for years without any problems." "Because the previous owner allowed it," Jake said. "My grandfather was a nice man who didn't mind people walking on his property. But he's gone now, and I do mind." Barbara turned to face Jake directly. "Your grandfather would be ashamed of how you're treating his neighbors. My grandfather would understand that property rights matter." Officer Kim closed her notebook. "Folks, this is clearly a civil dispute. Mr. Miller has the right to control access to his property. If you believe you have legal easement rights, Ms. Henderson, you'll need to pursue that through the courts." "So you're just going to let him get away with this?" Barbara demanded. "We're going to let him exercise his legal rights as a property owner," Sergeant Torres said. "Which is exactly what we should do." Barbara stared at the officers in disbelief. "This is completely unacceptable. I want to speak to your supervisor." "You can file a complaint at the station if you'd like," Sergeant Torres replied. "But the situation here is clear. No laws are being broken." The officers returned to their cars, leaving Barbara standing in Jake's driveway, looking defeated and furious. Jake went back to working on his gate. "This isn't over," Barbara said, her voice shaking. "Yes, it is," Jake replied without looking up. "Our community will not be pushed around by someone who doesn't understand how things work around here." Jake stopped working and looked at Barbara. "Barbara, let me explain how things actually work. This is my land. I can put up a gate, a fence, a wall, or a moat if I want to. Your community's convenience doesn't override my property rights. We'll see about that." Barbara stomped back to her car and drove away, but not before making another phone call that Jake could partially hear through her open window. Something about escalating the situation and community legal action. Jake finished installing the gate that afternoon. It swung smoothly across the road and locked with a heavy-duty padlock. He attached a sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing, owner's permission required for access." That evening, Jake's cousin Danny called to check on the situation. "The police sided with you, which is good," Danny said, "but be careful. People who call 911 over civil disputes aren't thinking rationally. She might try something else." "Like what?" "Could be anything. False reports to code enforcement, harassment complaints, maybe even vandalism if she gets desperate enough. Document everything and don't engage with her unless you have to." Sunday morning, Jake was testing his new gate when he noticed a small crowd gathering at the end of his driveway. About a dozen people from the neighborhood were standing just outside his property line, looking at the gate and talking among themselves. One of them, an elderly man with a walking stick, called out to Jake, "Excuse me, young man. How are we supposed to get through for our morning walk?" "You're not," Jake called back. "This is private property." "But we always walk back here," said a woman with a small dog. "Not anymore." The crowd stood there for several more minutes, talking quietly among themselves and occasionally looking at Jake like he was some kind of criminal. Finally, they turned around and walked back toward the neighborhood. Jake watched them go, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. These weren't bad people. They were just neighbors who had gotten used to using his property and didn't understand why that had to change. But as Jake locked his gate and headed back to his cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that Barbara Henderson wasn't going to give up this easily. The way she'd acted when the police refused to help her, the phone call she'd made, something told him this was just the beginning of a much bigger problem. 3 days after Jake installed his gate, Sergeant Torres was back at his property, but this time he wasn't alone. With him was Detective Wilson from the county sheriff's office, and both officers looked serious. "Mr. Miller," Sergeant Torres said as Jake approached them, "we need to ask you some questions about your property boundaries." "Sure, what's going on?" Detective Wilson pulled out a notebook. "We've received some concerning information about this property dispute. It turns out there might be more to this situation than anyone realized." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What kind of information?" "Well, we started looking into the property records more carefully after Ms. Henderson filed a formal complaint about your gate. She claimed that part of your property actually belonged to the HOA community. That's ridiculous. I have the deed right here." Jake pulled out his property documents. "We know," Sergeant Torres said, "but when we checked the county records to verify everything, we found something interesting about Ms. Henderson's property." Detective Wilson flipped through his notebook. "It appears that Ms. Henderson's house was built partially on land that was never properly transferred to her when she bought the property in 2018. Jake stared at the detective. "What do you mean?" "The original survey from 1987, when her lot was created, contained an error. The lot was supposed to end 200 feet from the main road, but the survey accidentally extended it 300 feet, directly onto what has always been your family's property." "So her house is on my land?" "Part of it, yes. The back portion of her house and most of her backyard are actually on property that belongs to you." Jake felt dizzy. "How is that possible?" Sergeant Torres pulled out a folder with official-looking documents. When people buy houses, they usually trust that the previous surveys were correct. Ms. Henderson's realtor and lawyer apparently never caught the error. She's been paying property taxes on land she doesn't actually own. And she knew about this? Detective Wilson nodded grimly. "That's where it gets interesting. We found records showing that the county sent her multiple notices about the boundary dispute over the past 4 years. She received official letters explaining that her property survey was incorrect and that she needed to resolve the issue." "What did she do about it?" "Nothing officially. But now we understand why she was so determined to establish community access to your road. If she could prove that the HOA had easement rights to your property, it might help her legal position when the boundary dispute eventually came to court." Jake sat down on his porch steps, trying to process this information. "So all this stuff about community rights and prescriptive easements was probably a strategy to legitimize her illegal occupation of your land," Detective Wilson confirmed. "She couldn't admit that her property boundaries were wrong, so she created a story about community access rights instead." Sergeant Torres looked sympathetic. "We think she was hoping that if enough people used your property regularly, and if she could document that usage, she might be able to claim that the community had established rights that would support her boundary claims. That's why she had people taking photos and keeping records of who used the road." Jake realized. Exactly. She was building a file to use in court. But she was doing it based on false pretenses. She told her neighbors they had legitimate access rights, when really she was just trying to create evidence to support her own illegal property claims. Detective Wilson closed his notebook. "The good news for you is that this completely invalidates any easement claims. You can't establish prescriptive easement rights when the person encouraging the use doesn't actually have authority over the property." "What happens now?" "Well, Ms. Henderson has a serious problem. She's been living in a house that's partially built on land she doesn't own, and she's been trying to manipulate the legal system to avoid dealing with that fact." Sergeant Torres pulled out another document. The county is going to require her to resolve this boundary issue within 6 months. She'll either need to purchase the disputed land from you at fair market value, or she'll need to move the part of her house that's on your property. And what about all the harassment and false police reports? Detective Wilson looked serious. That's still being investigated. Filing false reports, organizing trespass activities, and attempting to manipulate legal proceedings could result in charges. After the officers left, Jake walked around his property with a surveyor's map they'd given him. According to the correct boundaries, Barbara Henderson's back deck, pool, and garden shed were all sitting on his land. Her driveway extended about 50 feet onto his property as well. Jake's phone rang. It was his cousin Danny. "You're not going to believe this," Jake said, and he told Danny everything the police had discovered. "Holy cow," Danny said when Jake finished. "So she's been living on your land for years and trying to create a legal justification for it by claiming the HOA had access rights." "That's what it looks like." "Jake, this is huge. Do you know what that land is worth? And she's been paying utilities and maintaining improvements on property she doesn't own. The detective said I could require her to buy it from me or move her house. Moving a house would cost way more than buying the land. She's going to have to pay you whatever you ask, within reason." That evening, Jake received a phone call from Robert Chen, who identified himself as the current president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA. "Mr. Miller, I want to apologize on behalf of our entire community," Robert said. "We just learned about Barbara Henderson's deception and we're absolutely horrified. You didn't know about the boundary dispute?" "We had no idea. Barbara handled all community legal matters, and she never mentioned any issues with property boundaries. We all thought the access arrangements with your grandfather were legitimate, and that you were just being difficult about continuing them." "What's the community's reaction?" "People are furious. We trusted Barbara to represent our interests honestly, and instead she used our community to support her own illegal property claims. Several families are talking about taking legal action against her for involving them in trespassing activities." Robert paused. "Mr. Miller, I want you to know that our community has no intention of pursuing any access claims to your property. We understand now that we never had any legitimate rights to use your road, and we're sorry for any harassment you experienced." "I appreciate that. Robert, is there anything we can do to make up for the problems Barbara caused?" Jake thought for a moment. "Just make sure everyone understands that my property is off limits. I don't want any more people wandering around back here thinking they have permission." "Absolutely. We're sending a letter to all residents explaining the situation and making it clear that your property is completely private." The next morning, Jake was surprised to see Barbara Henderson walking up his driveway. She looked terrible. Her hair was messy, her clothes were wrinkled, and her eyes were red like she'd been crying. "I need to talk to you," she said when she reached his porch. "I don't think that's a good idea, Barbara. You should probably talk to a lawyer instead. Please, just give me 5 minutes." Jake stayed on his porch but didn't invite her up. "What do you want?" Barbara's voice was shaky. "I know you found out about the boundary issue. I know the police told you about my property survey problems. Yeah, they did. I want you to know that I never meant for things to get this crazy. When I first moved here, I had no idea there was a problem with my property boundaries. I just thought I owned what my realtor told me I owned." "When did you find out the truth?" Barbara looked down at her feet. "About 4 years ago when the county sent me the first letter. But by then I'd already invested so much money in landscaping and improvements on that land. My pool, my deck, my garden. Everything I'd worked for was sitting on property I didn't actually own. So you decided to create a fake easement claim instead of dealing with the problem honestly?" I panicked. I thought if I could show that the community had established usage rights to your family's property, it might help my case when the boundary dispute went to court. I never intended to hurt anyone or cause all this trouble." Jake felt a mixture of anger and pity. "Barbara, you involved dozens of innocent people in trespassing activities. You filed false police reports. You tried to intimidate me into giving up my property rights. I know it was wrong. I'm going to lose my house, Jake. Even if I could afford to buy that land from you, the HOA is probably going to kick me out for what I did. And there might be criminal charges." Jake didn't know what to say. Part of him felt sorry for Barbara, but she'd brought this situation on herself through years of deception and manipulation. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Barbara looked up with tears in her eyes. "I want to make this right. I'll pay you whatever the land is worth. I'll cover all your legal expenses. I'll apologize publicly to the community for what I did. Just please don't press for criminal charges. Jake studied Barbara's face, trying to figure out if this was genuine remorse or just another manipulation attempt. I'll think about it, he said finally. But you need to stay off my property while I decide. Barbara nodded and walked away, leaving Jake alone with the biggest decision of this entire mess. Jake spent the next week thinking about Barbara's offer and talking to lawyers about his options. The land she'd been illegally occupying was worth about $40,000, according to a professional appraisal. Her deck, pool, and landscaping had probably cost her twice that much to install. His lawyer, David Park, laid out the situation clearly. You have her completely over a barrel, David explained during their meeting. She's been living on your land for years without permission. She's made permanent improvements to property she doesn't own, and she organized a harassment campaign to try to cover up her illegal occupation. But she seemed genuinely sorry when she came to apologize. Maybe she is sorry. But that doesn't change the fact that she committed multiple crimes and put you through months of stress and harassment. You don't owe her anything. David pulled out a folder with several documents. Here are your options. Option 1. You can demand that she remove all improvements from your land and pay you fair market rent for the years she's been using it illegally. That would probably bankrupt her. What's option 2? You can offer to sell her the disputed land at fair market value. She gets to keep her house and improvements, but she pays you what the land is worth plus your legal expenses. And option 3? You can be generous and offer her a below-market price for the land, essentially giving her a discount in exchange for a quick resolution. That would save both of you from a long court battle. Jake thought about his grandfather, who had always been generous with his neighbors, but his grandfather had also been clear about respecting property rights. What would you recommend? Honestly, option 2. She pays fair market value plus legal expenses. It's generous enough to avoid looking vindictive, but it doesn't reward her for years of deception and harassment. That afternoon, Jake called Barbara and arranged to meet at a neutral location, the coffee shop in town where they could discuss terms without either of them feeling threatened. Barbara arrived early and was already sitting at a corner table when Jake walked in. She looked nervous and tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. Thank you for meeting with me, she said as Jake sat down. I've talked to my lawyer about your situation, Jake said, without any small talk. I'm willing to sell you the disputed land for $40,000 plus my legal expenses, which are about $3,000 so far. Barbara's face showed relief. That's fair. That's more than fair, actually. There are conditions. What conditions? Jake pulled out a document his lawyer had prepared. First, you pay everything up front. No payment plans, no delayed settlements. Second, you issue a written apology to the HOA community explaining what you did and why. Third, you stay completely away from my property except for necessary boundary surveys and legal paperwork. Barbara read through the agreement carefully. What about criminal charges? I won't actively pursue them, but I can't control what the district attorney decides to do. The police reports are already filed. I understand. Barbara's voice was quiet. Jake, I know I don't deserve your generosity, but I want you to know that I'm grateful you're giving me a way to fix this. I'm not doing it for you, Jake said honestly. I'm doing it because dragging this through court for 2 years would be a hassle for everyone involved. Barbara signed the agreement, and they shook hands awkwardly. I'll have the money transferred to your account by Friday, she said. Good. And Barbara, if you ever set foot on my property again without permission, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. I understand completely. The money transfer went through as promised. And by the following week, Jake officially owned his entire property without any boundary disputes. Barbara had her property boundaries legally corrected, and both of them could move on with their lives. But the story wasn't quite over yet. 2 weeks after their settlement, Jake received a visit from Robert Chen, the new HOA president, and 3 other community members. We wanted to thank you personally for how you handled this situation, Robert said. A lot of people in your position would have made Barbara's life much more difficult than you did. I just wanted the problem resolved. Well, you should know that your fairness didn't go unnoticed in the community. We also wanted to let you know that we've made some changes to prevent anything like this from happening again. One of the other residents, an older woman named Patricia, spoke up. We've implemented new rules requiring any HOA legal claims to be reviewed by an actual attorney before any community action is taken. No more taking one person's word about property rights. That's smart, Jake agreed. Robert pulled out an envelope. We also wanted to give you this. Inside the envelope was a gift certificate to a local restaurant and a card signed by about 30 residents. The card thanked Jake for his patience with the community and apologized for the harassment he'd experienced. You didn't have to do this, Jake said. Yes, we did, Patricia replied. Barbara manipulated all of us into participating in activities that were wrong and probably illegal. We feel terrible about what you went through. After the HOA representatives left, Jake sat on his porch and looked out at his property. His gate was still in place and he planned to keep it that way. But the constant tension and stress of the past few months was finally gone. His phone rang. It was his cousin Danny. How does it feel to have your property back? Danny asked. It feels good. Quiet. And you're $43,000 richer. Yeah, that doesn't hurt either. Have you heard anything about what happened to Barbara? Jake had heard rumors around town, but he hadn't paid much attention to them. I heard she resigned from the HOA and put her house up for sale. Probably a good idea. Fresh start somewhere else. Maybe. Danny was quiet for a moment. Jake, you handled this whole thing really well. A lot of people would have been more vindictive. I keep thinking about what my grandfather would have done. He was generous with his neighbors, but he also didn't let people take advantage of him. Sounds like you found the right balance. After Jake hung up, he walked down to his gate and looked out at the main highway. Cars were passing by, people heading to work or running errands, living their normal lives without any drama or property disputes. Jake unlocked his gate and walked back toward his cabin. Tomorrow he was going to start working on the improvements his grandfather had always talked about, but never gotten around to. Maybe a workshop behind the cabin, or a better garden where his grandmother's flowers used to grow. For the first time since inheriting the property, Jake felt like he could make long-term plans without worrying about neighbors trying to claim parts of his land or HOA, presidents organizing harassment campaigns. The whole experience had taught him something important about standing up for his rights while still trying to be fair to others. Barbara had created the problem through her own deception and manipulation, but Jake had found a way to resolve it without destroying anyone's life. As he reached his front door, Jake could hear birds singing in the trees his grandfather had planted decades ago. The property was quiet and peaceful again, exactly the way it was supposed to be. Jake went inside his cabin, made a cup of coffee, and started planning the improvements he wanted to make to his land. His land with clear boundaries and no disputes about who owned what. The gate would stay locked, but Jake was finally ready to start thinking about this place as home rather than just a legal battleground. Barbara Henderson had tried to steal his property through manipulation and false claims. But in the end, the truth had won out. And sometimes, Jake thought as he sipped his coffee and looked out at his peaceful acres, that's the best outcome anyone can hope for.